the International Soccer Preview. We are Soccer Files Canada. Welcome to Series 20, the 2023 African Cup. This episode is looking at the players of Ivory Coast. Here we go. Hello and welcome to the International Soccer Preview by Soccer Files Canada. I'm Kevin, and this is a continuation of Series 20 on the 2023 African Cup, played in January 2024. We've done a full and short version on the groups and teams, and so now are turning our attention to looking at the players of each team, this episode covering Ivory Coast's players. We're doing this mediacast in two parts. Part one here is a look at the candidates for the squad and their likelihood of making it. Part two will come out when the squad lists are released and the final squad selected. We think that'll be in early January of 2024. And at that time, we'll go back over the list we compiled today and see who made it and who didn't. That'll be part two. And we'll also cover a few other things in part two that I'll talk about at the end of the media cast here. We did do a series on the 24 teams of the African Cup in 2022 and covered their players there. And actually 5 of these teams were also covered even more recently in our World Cup series. Since those are quite recent, we're taking this opportunity to experiment with our format a little bit. Here, for the teams we have covered before, we're going to be trying out what I call the spotlight system, going into detail on only the players that we predict will be starters. But we're going to post links in the show notes to our previous media casts, which will offer more detail on the supporting players. And we've made a separate video on what we're going to be covering over the next 9 months. YouTube watchers can see the link to that on the screen, and we'll also place it in the show notes for both watchers and listeners. In short, we've just completed our series on the groups, teams, and players, at least part one of the players, for the 2023 Asian Cup, and now we're focusing on the 2023 African Cup, both of those taking place in early 2024. And furthermore, we've also started coverage of World Cup 2026 qualifying by looking at the preliminary round of the Asian Cup the Asian World Cup qualifying there. Okay, so this episode will have 3 sections. Section 1, where we give some general information on the team. Section 2 is the main part. We look at the main candidates in each position and judge their likelihood of making the final squad. And Section 3 will give any closing thoughts and preview part 2 in more detail. So let's begin then with Section 1. And we'll start with a few observations on the squad here. So first one is the African Nations Championship. So this is a competition that is played, but countries can only use in-country players for this competition. So those are generally, especially for Ivory Coast, not players who make the national team for competitions like this. So basically what we've decided is for those players who have only played in the African Nations Championship, those are left off our list unless they actually join the senior team. Another point to note for Ivory Coast is that club affiliations matter. In fact, this seems to be one of the main criterion for selection among Ivory Coast and some other African teams. So players can actually come and go from the team or from the starting positions according to their rise and fall in the hierarchy of the clubs that they play for. But while we don't want to get bogged down in a long list of the club history of each player, we're going to try to balance by providing an update on the players since 2 years ago when we covered the team, and an overview. So that's part of our reason for using the spotlight candidates. We'll see how it goes, and we may have to make changes along the way. Finally, and specifically for Ivory Coast, is position shifting. So the position players are coded for don't seem to matter as much for Ivory Coast. You'll get players on the right wing who are coded as right wingers, but you'll see them playing in the central midfield or as forwards or on the left. So basically, we've tried to place players in the position that best fits our narrative, and that's likely the position they've played in most recently. And we're looking at the last 2 years, as we'll talk about soon. Let's look at any major retirements then, and really for Ivory Coast, there's just one, and that is Captain Siri Daye. Siri Daye. Hang on, I got to expand my thing. We won't go into too much detail here, but he was captain of the team. He's been on the team since 2013 to 2022. He actually retired from soccer, his club and country, in July 2022, and played his last game for the national team in the 2021 African Cup. So farewell to Siri Daye, and really the only major retirement over the last couple of years. We do have players who seem to be off the squad. They're not playing for the team anymore, but we'll mention those as we go because they haven't officially retired and there is a chance that they may come back. Let's look at club affiliations for Ivory Coast. And, well, we usually look at main domestic clubs when we do this, but for Ivory Coast, basically if players play locally, they're not going to make the national team. So the top players don't play locally, and in fact some of them were not born in country. The national team is really made up of players from top teams all over the world, but one of the feeder teams kind of coming out of Ivory Coast, probably the main team is ASEC Mimosas, probably the main team within country. But for the national team players, we look to clubs outside of the country. So predominantly Europe, but they do have several in Saudi Arabia. They have one in China, one in South Africa, and one, interestingly, in Ethiopia. That's a backup goalkeeper there. And when we talk about the European countries, which is where most of them are playing, the predominant countries right now are England, Turkey, and France. But really, it's in all major countries in Europe. And we usually give a list of big names that players play for, but it would be a long list if we let it get too long. So we have to stick with the biggest names because they have players with some of the biggest teams there. Manchester United, Borussia Dortmund, Roma, Sporting Lisbon, and the list goes on. So top players with top clubs for Ivory Coast. Pretty impressive, actually. Next, what we're going to look at is recent games. So we are going to consider the participation of each player and actually make our decision as to how likely they are to make it to the squad based on the games that they've played since the African Cup in 2021. So if they've been called up regularly since then, we'll consider them likely. And if they have not been called up, then we think that they're dropping off the team. So let's begin with the African Cup in 2021. Sorry, that was actually in 2022. The 2021 African Cup in January of 2022. So there were 4 games there: Equatorial Guinea, Sierra Leone, Algeria, and Egypt. And when we do our narrative on the position, we'll kind of start with who played in those games. But we have had games since, of course. So 2 friendlies in March 2022 against France and England. Next came African Cup 2023 qualification. Those were the first 2 games of the 6 games that they're going to play in all. These 2 were against Zambia and Lesotho. There were 2 games of African Cup African Nations Championship qualification. I think I won't add them to the list because it just complicates things. And as I said, these are not players who really factor into the main national team. So let's skip that and go to friendlies. 2 in September 2022. Those were against Togo and Guinea. None in October 2022, even though a lot of teams do schedule games in October. And 2 in November 2022, Burundi and Burkina Faso. In January of 2023 was the African Nations Championship itself. Again, though, we won't add it to the list because they're not players who factor in here. And so we go to March 2023 for the completion of African Cup 2023 qualifications. 2 games in March, both against Comoros there, and 2 games in June. Oh no, 1 game in June, sorry, against Zambia, 1 game in September to finish up against Lesotho. And because we're talking about them here, we know that they were in the top 2 and reached the cup here. So 6 games of qualification in all for this African Cup. And finally, we look at the more recent games. 2 friendlies in October 2023 against Morocco and South Africa. And finally, in November 2022, World Cup 2026 qualification began. And they played 2 of the teams in their group there, Seychelles and Gambia. So there we have it for Ivory Coast, and that is, let me see, that is 24 games in all. A couple of times we leave out games because we don't have sufficient information on them, but I don't think that was the case for Ivory Coast. So 24 games is what we're using to consider the players' participation. Okay, and we're not actually particularly interested in the results of those games. For the Players podcast, we're actually more interested in the formations they used, and we're really making a long story short here. We don't want to go into the weeds too much. In the African Cup back in 2022, in January, they used a 4-3-3 formation in all 4 of those games, and they've used it fairly commonly since. They kind of went away from it, maybe experimented a bit. The only formations they used more than once were the 4-2-1-3 and the 4-4-2. But not as much as the 4-3-3, which they actually kind of came back to towards the end here, and they seem to use it especially in the games that are more important. So actually, in the last 4 games, it's been the 4-3-3. So when we talk about the teams, it'll be good to keep in mind the 4-3-3 formation. So generally 2 central defenders, a right back and a left back, 3 in the middle, a central midfielder, right midfielder and left midfielder. And then usually, even though it looks like 3 forwards, it's actually probably more like a left attacking midfielder and a right attacking midfielder together with a single forward is the usual formation. All right, we'll end this section by looking at any pre-tournament friendlies they have. And actually, Ivory Coast have scheduled one, and that is on January 5th against Mozambique at home. Mozambique also playing in the African Cup. And we do expect maybe 1 or 2 more friendlies to be scheduled. All right, that is it for section 1. Let's move on to section 2 and a look at the candidates. But we'll talk about the managers first. And the outgoing manager is Patrice Baumel. We'll just put his name in red here just to show that he is the outgoing manager there. Patrice Baumel was manager of Ivory Coast during the 2021 African Cup there at the beginning of 2022, and had since gone on. Sorry, I'll say his contract expired and in April of 2022, and the new manager took over. Meanwhile, he went on to manage MC Alger in Algeria, one of the bigger clubs in Algeria. So farewell to Patrice Baumel, and welcome to Jean-Louis Gasset. So you'll see that Jean-Louis Gasset's name is in gray here, whereas Patrice Baumel's name was in black. So the black indicates that they had been through a tournament. So Baumel did manage them in the 2021 African Cup. That was his only international tournament. Whereas Jean-Louis Gasset does not have international tournament experience. In fact, Jean-Louis Gasset has been an assistant manager for most of his career, but with some fairly big teams, including Paris Saint-Germain twice, Bordeaux in France once, and the France national team. He was assistant manager of them from 2010 to 12. From 2017, he became a manager in his own right with Saint-Etienne in France and Bordeaux in France, returning to become the main manager of that team. And from April 2022, manager of the Ivory Coast. So he will get international experience through this tournament, but he doesn't have any yet. And there we have it. Okay, let us take a look at our goalkeepers then, and we begin with Yahya Fofana as a definite candidate. We will come back to him because he's going to be our spotlight player, and we have two likely candidates. So I'll introduce them as we go here in this new format. The first one is Badr Ali Sangaer. And he has been with the Ivory Coast since 2009, a fairly experienced player, only 30 caps. He's been on the roster for many tournaments since the 2013 African Cup, but usually as a backup keeper. In 2021 African Cup, though, in 2022 there, he started and finished all 4 games. So he was a starter. Now he seems to have lost it again. He is playing for Sekhukhune United in South Africa since 2020, and we consider him a likely candidate. He started 13 of the 24 games over the past 2 years and was on the bench for 7, and not selected for the 4 African Nations Championship. So even though he seems to have lost his starting position, he is nevertheless being called up to the bench. So we think he's likely to be the backup keeper. The other likely candidate is Charles Foley, or Charles Foley Ayayi. And he is the only player actually playing in the Ivory Coast right now. He's with the team I mentioned, ASEC Mimosas, since 2022. And he got his first cap in January 2023. He started 6 of their remaining 12 games. Was on the bench for 6 others, so we think he's likely too. And the one candidate who is possible but unlikely, I'll just mention, is Ira Eliezer Tape. And he's been a backup keeper for a couple of tournaments, including the 2021 African Cup. Didn't start any of their games over the past 2 years, but was on the bench for 11. But not selected for the last 5 matches. So we think at this point, Tape is unlikely. Well, there we have it. And he also plays in the Ivory Coast, actually, with San Pedro. I thought he was I think he is actually playing for a team in Ethiopia now. So I'm going to say so. Plays in Ethiopia. Okay, and let us do a summary of the position then. So Sangaer, Badr Ali Sangaer, played in the African Cup and continued on as a starter until March 2023. Foley was the keeper in the African Nations Championship. That's where he got his starts, and was one of the very few players from the African Nations Championship to actually transition to the main team, where he started 2 games for them. After that, though, it was Fofana that took over as the starter, and he has started every game since his first call-up in 2023. So that would be the last 6 games that Fofana has started. So I'm going to highlight him in green as our spotlight candidate, Yahya Fofana. Despite recently joining the team in 2023 and being just 23 years old, he started all 6 of their remaining games up until this point. We're doing this podcast at the end of November 2023. So he was born in France. He plays for Angers in France, which is not really a high-level team, but maybe they're looking to kind of transition him into the starting position over Sangaré, who is, after all, 37 years old. So Yahya Fofana, we think it's going to be the starter for the African Cup in January here. Okay, let's move on to defenders. And we look at central defenders. So we have a definite candidate in Evan Indika. So we're going to spotlight him. So we won't give any information on him yet. And Ousmane Diomande, we consider likely. And Willy Bolly also likely. So we're going to spotlight those 2 as well. Willy Bolly has been involved in a tournament, so actually we'll just change his name into a black text color here, Willy Bolly. And we have a lot of other candidates at the possible level. We're not going to do much beyond naming these. So possible candidate Odilon Kusuno, started 4 of their games, was subbed in for 3 and on the bench for 5 over the last 24 games. He was a sub in the 2021 African Cup and has been with Bayer Leverkusen in Germany since 2021. So a possible candidate there. Next, we have Abakar Silla. Abakar Silla got his first appearance on the bench in September, so recently, and started, September 2022, and started 3 of their remaining 6 games, subbed in for 3 and on the bench for 3 of the 24 games. So not used that much. He has recently moved to Strasbourg in France, and the 21-year-old Silla has 6 caps for the national team. Next, we have a more experienced player, Eric Bailly, who's been with the team since 2015 with 49 caps. He's been involved in several tournaments and was a starter in the 2021 African Cup, but over the past 2 years has only started 8 of their 24 games, was on the bench for 1, and out with 4 separate injuries for 7 games. He was also suspended for 4 games. So kind of a lot of kind of doubt circulating around Eric Bailly. That's why we have him as a possible candidate. In terms of club, he recently moved to Besiktas in Turkey, and before that was with Man United for quite a while, from 2016 to 2023. So Eric Bailly, surprisingly just a possible candidate here. Also, perhaps surprisingly, Simon Deli, who's been with the team since 2015 and has 27 caps. He's kind of been involved in a few tournaments, but didn't make the final cut for the 2019 African Cup, but then was a starter in the 2021 African Cup. Over the past couple of years, he has started 9 of their 24 games and on the bench for 4 and not selected for 9 matches there. So, and the last 2 matches he wasn't selected for. In fact, Simon Deli only played 1 of the last 12 games. So despite being a starter in the 2021 African Cup, seems to be winding his way out of the team. So let's do a summary of the position here. Simon Deli and Eric Bailly started 3 of the 4 cup games, and it was Diomande replacing Bailey in or Bailly in game 3 there of the African Cup. But things started to change quickly after the Cup. Willie Bally came in, and then a slew of players. Wilfred Cannon, who is kind of off the team now. Let me see. I'm sorry. I should have put him on the list. Wilfred Cannon last played in June of 2022. So he seems to be off the team. But he did come in there for a while. Kusuno, Singo, Silla, Gbanim, and Ndika, all of those players showing up in central defense, even though some of them are not actually central defenders. But I don't want to confuse things more than they are already naturally confused. There really seems no pattern to it, except that some have played more than others. So basically it boils down to what we have here for our spotlight players, the ones who we think will be starters. So we're going to choose three. We think Evan Ndika and one of the other two, and really maybe a rotation of those two players. So let's spotlight Evan Ndika here, and he has been well, he got his first cap in September of 2023. So a bit like the goalie, has kind of suddenly inserted himself into a starting position ever since he came in. He started all 5 of their games over the past little while, and maybe his club has something to do with it, because he recently moved to Roma in Italy since 2023, and he was with Eintracht Frankfurt in Germany for 5 years before that, and with Auxerre in France. He is actually French-born, Evan Ndika. So we think he's going to be a starter. And then either Ousmane Diomande or Willie Bally. So we'll highlight both of them too. We'll actually highlight on the graphic here Ndika in green and Diomande and Bally in blue. I think honestly it'll be a rotation of those two. So Ousmane Diomande, also very new to the team in September 2023, and he started 3 of their remaining 5 games and was on the bench for the last 2 matches. So again, it's partly his club affiliation that we think is an argument in his favor. He's with Sporting Lisbon in Portugal since 2023, and he was with Midtjylland in Denmark prior to that. So a very young player, just 20 years old, but Ousmane Diomande, a potential starter, maybe rotating with Willie Bally, who has been with Ivory Coast a bit longer, since 2020, 15 caps and 1 goal. He joined Ivory Coast late because he's 32 years old now. So he was 29 years old when he got his first cap for Ivory Coast. He's currently with Wolverhampton Wanderers in England since 2018, but was with Porto in Portugal and Braga in Portugal before that. He is also French-born, and prior to his time in Portugal was also with Auxerre in France and with French teams prior to that. So he was part of the African Cup in 2021 or 2022, and but he was on the bench for game 1, kind of struggling with injury in that tournament. Okay, and Willie Bally started only 4 of their 24 games over the past 2 years, subbed in for 1 and on the bench for 8. So yes, neither he nor Diomande are really convincing candidates as starters, but as I said, it's been kind of a mix and match in the central defense. So these kind of at the current moment seem the most likely starters. Okay, let's move on to the left back position, and our spotlight player will be Ghislaine Conan. That is not to be confused with Wilfred Cannon, whose name looks similar, and we'll come back to him because he's our spotlight candidate. Beyond him, we just have 2 possible candidates. The first one is Hussein Kamara. Hussein Kamara has only started 3 of their 24 games over the past 2 years, subbed in for 1 and on the bench for 1. So actually not selected for 19 matches, and not selected for the 2021 African Cup squad either. But he has played a few games over the past 2 years. The other one is Souleymane Doumbia, and he returned from absence. Returned from almost a 3-year absence in September of 2022, and started 2 games, was subbed in for 2 and on the bench for 2, and then that's it. He was not selected for any of the last 6 matches, so almost unlikely at this point, Souleymane Doumbia. So let's look at a summary of the position before we focus on Konan. So it was Ghislaine Konan playing left back in all 4 games of the African Cup there in 2022. And Kamara began to share the spot shortly after, starting a couple of games, but in late 2022, it was neither of them. But Doumbia got a start there, and then strangely out of position players and the central defender Diomande, who we just met, and attacking midfielder Gamin. So I'm not sure what was going on there, but Konan did return to the position in March 2023 and held it for a while. But in the last 2 games, some strange goings on again with attacking midfielder Jeremy Boga coming back to play there, and Kamara getting another start. So nevertheless, we think the most likely starter here is Ghislaine Konan, as in the African Cup. So let's take a bit of a closer look at him. He's been with the team since 2017 with 31 caps, and as we said, was a starter in the African Cup 2021 squad. He wasn't selected though for the 2019 African Cup. Over the past 2 years, Konan has started 14 of their 24 games, as well as subbing in for 4 and being on the bench for 2. So, yes, almost always called up Ghislaine Konan, and starting about 2/3 of the games there. Okay, so let's highlight him in green here as our starter and move on to right backs. In the right back position, we have a likely candidate, 2 likely candidates. One is Wilfried Singo, and the other is Serge Aurier. And we're going to spotlight both of those players because for now it seems like they're sharing the position. We do have a possible candidate in Kouassi Atohula, and we'll talk about him just quickly here. He was actually a starter in the African Nations Championship, and again, one of the few players to actually move up to the senior team. But in his case, it was only 3 bench appearances on the senior team. So he plays for Young Africans in Tanzania. That's why he was part of the African Nations Champions, because he's African based. But I would actually kind of consider him an unlikely candidate. And yeah, we do have a couple of other candidates who we won't mention here unless they make it to the final squad. So let's go back and summarize the position and then look at our spotlight players. So this position a few times has become a central defensive role when there's a 3-man central defense. That doesn't happen on the left side, but on the right side, we've seen both Singo and Aurier come back to play a left central defender. Anyway, Habib Maiga started the African Cup in 2021. He's well off the team now. He hasn't played since that African Cup. But in the second game, Serge Aurier gained the starting position, and he played the rest of the tournament as the right back. As time went, Singo increasingly shared the position, and we can almost say they're sharing the position now. But I would say edging out is still Serge Aurier. So I'm actually going to move him ahead of Singo in the list here. But let's take a closer look at both of those players, because I I'm going to kind of predict that they're sharing the position now, but I give Serge Aurier the edge in that. So we'll start by looking at him. He's a veteran of the team since 2013 with 87 caps. He's 29 years old and has recently been moving around clubs. Moved to Nottingham Forest in England in 2022 and was with Villarreal in Spain for a year before that. And many of us will know him, though, from his time with Tottenham in England and Paris Saint-Germain before that. So a good resume for clubs there. And also in his international career, since he's been a starter and at times a captain of the Ivory Coast team. For the 2021 African Cup, he was a captain. As we said, though, he didn't start in game 1, but he did from game 2 onwards. Over the past 2 years, Aurier has started 13 of their 24 games, and he was on the bench for 2 and not selected for 9 matches there, so sometimes not called up. And in fact, he only played 4 of the last 8 games, which is why I'm kind of claiming that Singo seems to be sharing the role. So let's take a look at Wilfried Singo. He has been with the team since 2021 and has 11 caps. He's 23 years old and recently moved to Monaco in the French league and was with Torino in Italy before that. He did get his first cap in 2021, but he was off the team for 15 months until he came back in September 2022 to start 5 of their remaining 16 games. And he was subbed in for 3 and on the bench for 4. So I would say if Singo is not sharing the position, he's getting closer to it and will be brought to the tournament, if not getting a couple of starts there, at least as the main backup for Serge Aurier. But I'm going to be bold and prepare and predict that they will both get starts in the Cup. Okay, let's move on to the midfield, and I'm going to do something a bit unusual here. I'm going to cover all of the central midfield in one big gulp. So we've seen actually their favorite formation is a 4-3-3. So I'm looking at those 3 positions. Really, there's no distinction between defensive midfielder and central midfielder there. It's just 3 across the middle. So a right midfielder and a left midfielder. So we'll look at all of those positions, but we will go according to the positions the players are coded for. So for defensive midfielder, we only have someone at the possible level, and that's Idrissa Doumbia. And Doumbia got his first cap in June of 2023 there. He started 1 game on the bench for 1 and not selected for the last 4. So we don't think he's going to be actually at the Cup. Making him that much more unlikely is that he dropped, he played for Sporting Lisbon in Portugal from 2018 to 2023 and then kind of dropped to Al Ahly in Qatar. So no insult to the Qatari team, but that is a bit of a drop in the status of his club. And as we know with Ivory Coast, that matters. Okay, next we have a couple of other candidates as defensive midfielders, but we won't mention them. One of them was the Siri Daye, who we mentioned, who had retired. So really not many candidates coded as defensive midfielders, and not many even as central midfielder. In fact, we're moving an out of position candidate to talk about him here, and that is Jean-Michel Seri, and we're putting him in as a likely candidate. He's actually coded as a central attacking midfielder, but he has been playing in the center of the midfield, especially. Yes, Jean-Michel Seri. I'm just wondering to myself whether he is a spotlight candidate, and he actually isn't, because he's being kind of used decreasingly, as we'll see when we get to the summary. So I might as well cover the details on him that we'll cover now. So Jean-Michel Seri with the team since 2015, and he has 49 caps. And he's been part of the starting lineup for the African Cup for the last three of them, 2017, 2019, and in both of those, actually, he was a starter, but he lost his starting position in both of them. But in 2021, he started all 4 games there. And then over the past 2 years, Seri started 11 of their 14 games. He was subbed in for 4 and on the bench for 6. But as we said, he's kind of moved recently from a starting position to more of a sub or a bench position. So we're not going to put him in the spotlight here. In terms of his club affiliations, he's with Hull in England right now, so they're not in the Premier League. Since 2022. He was with Fulham in England, which was in the Premier League. He was with them from 2018 to 2022. And he has played for Bordeaux and Galatasaray. So it seems to be kind of in decline a little bit, Jean-Michel Seri. And our other central midfielder is at the possible level. That is Seko Fofana. And Seko Fofana. He returned after an almost 3-year absence in September 2022 and started 6 of their games, including the last 4. So that recent involvement might make him a candidate to be a starter. But he wasn't selected for 10 matches. So I wonder, because of those recent starts, whether we should put him up to likely, but we had him at the possible level. He really wasn't that much involved since he started the last 4 games, and he too has suffered a bit of a decline in his club status. He was with Lens in France and Udinese in Italy before that, but in 2023 is with Al Nassr in Saudi Arabia, so that's a bit of a drop there. So Seko Fofana, born in France, we'll leave him at the possible level now, even though that recent involvement may work well in his favour. And before we summarise the positions, we're going to do right and left midfielders. And in fact, we don't have any candidates coded as left midfielders, but we have 2 definite candidates coded as right midfielders, and they're going to be part of our story. So the first one is Ibrahim Sangaré, and he's going to be in the spotlight. And Franck Kessie, who will also be in the spotlight here. And to be honest, to be honest, I think either Jean-Michel Seri or Fofana will be starting alongside them. Again, if we imagine the 4-3-3. But if they go with the 4-2-1-3, it could be just Sangaré and Kessie. So that's why we're going to spotlight them and not the others. But let's do a summary of the basically the entire central midfield first. And the central attacking midfielder, Jean-Michel Seri, played as the central midfielder in the 4-3-3 of the Cup. So he was there in the middle, and it was Sangaré and Kessie accompanying him, playing as left midfielder, obviously out of position there, and right midfielder there. When they changed to a 4-2-1-3 and the midfield became a 2-man midfield, it was Seri and one of those 2, Sangaré or Kessie. So Seri was the staple there for a while. And in the middle, a few others came into the mix. Towards the end, we see it's Fofana in the last 4 games coming into the mix, kind of at the expense of Seri, actually. So Seri played less, and Sangaré and Kessie both took up the central position at different times in the midfield. So the 2-man midfield or the 3-man midfield now had Sangaré and Kessie in the center of it. So maybe it's best to think of it as a rotation among four of them. I would say most currently with Sangaré and Kessie definitely there, and recently Fofana, but it wouldn't be a surprise to see Seri come back in and those four rotating. Anyway, as we said, we can't guarantee that either Seri or Fofana will be the starter, but we're pretty confident that Sangaré and Kessie both will be. So let's take a look at them in the spotlight. So Ibrahim Sangaré was with Ivory Coast since 2015 and has 36 caps and a pretty healthy 11 goals there. He also is with Nottingham Forest in England. He just moved there in 2023 and was with PSV Eindhoven before that and Toulouse in France prior to that. So he's just 26 years old. But he was part of the Asian Cup in 2019 as a sub, but as a starter for the 2021 African Cup. Over the past 2 years, Sangaré has started 17 of their 24 games and subbed in for one and on the bench for two. So always called up and almost always starts. Keep in mind, 4 of those games were African Nations Championship. So he wouldn't have been part of those anyway. So there we go. That is Ibrahim Sangaré. And then our other spotlight candidate, Franck Kessie, with Ivory Coast since 2014 with 69 caps. And actually, he kind of made a move down recently to Al Ahly in Saudi Arabia. I hope I'm not insulting Saudi Arabia. Some of these teams are competitive in the Asian League and good teams, but they are kind of a move down from the teams Franck Kessie played for, Barcelona in Spain and AC Milan in Italy prior to that. So he was a starter in the 2017 and 2019 African Cups, as well as the 2021 African Cup, as we saw there in the central midfield. And over the past 2 years, Franck Kessie has started 16 of their 24 games. He was subbed in for one and injured for two. So almost always called up and quite regularly a starter. So that is the story of the central midfield. And now we move on upfield. We have left wingers here, but really the position is both left winger or left attacking midfield, depending on the formation. And actually in the 4-3-3, that also looks like a left forward, but really more of a left attacking midfielder. Anyway, let's look at the candidates here. We have a definite candidate in Max Alain Gradel. And a likely candidate in Christian Kouame, and also in Simon Adingra, both of those likely candidates. And then we have 3 possible candidates, Cornet Maxwell, Jean-Everett Kouassi, and I'll just put ahead of him, put Jonathan Bamba ahead of Kouassi there, just because he seems a bit more likely. Okay, well, let's look at I actually will just give a quick bio on those 3 likely players, because we're going to no, I'm going to start with Max Alain Gradel, because he is actually not going to be one of our highlighted players. So a veteran with the team since 2011. He has 106 caps, but he is 36 years old and is actually kind of losing his starting position, which is why we won't be highlighting him. He recently moved to Gaziantep in Turkey and was with Sivasspor in Turkey before that. And he's been part of the squad for many tournaments since the 2012 African Cup, actually. And he was a starter in the 2021 African Cup in 3 of the 4 games at least. But over the past 2 years, he kind of declined in his starting role. We think he's a definite candidate, but we think he'll be more of a sub in this African Cup. So he started 8 of their 24 games over the past 2 years, Max Allen Gradel, and he subbed in for 7 and was on the bench for 5, including the last 2 matches. So definitely kind of moving towards a supporting role, Max Allen Gradel, but we do think he will definitely come to the Cup, if only for his leadership. The players we will be spotlighting are Christian Kouame and Simon Adingra, so we'll come back to them. And Maxwell Cornet, we'll just briefly deal with him. He has been with the team since 2017 with 31 caps and 6 goals, and is currently with West Ham in England, and was with Burnley for a short time and Lyon in France for 6 years until 2021. He was a sub in the 2019 African Cup and a starter in the 2021 African Cup, but after game 1, he lost his position. So over the past 2 years, Cornet has been around, but he only started 4 of their 24 games, subbed in for 2 and on the bench for 3, and hasn't been selected for the last 4 matches, so we're not even sure he'll make the squad here. Jonathan Bamba is new to the team. He got his first cap in June 2023, but he did start 3 of their remaining 6 games and was subbed in for 1, but not selected for the last 2 matches. So Jonathan Bamba possible. Also possible is Jean-Evrard Kouassi. He's the one who plays in China with Zhejiang, and he was with he was actually with clubs in China for a while, apart from a short time in Turkey. He was part of the 2021 African Cup squad, but he was just a sub in 1 game there. He started 4 of their 24 games over the last 2 years, and he was subbed in for 3 and on the bench for 6, but not selected for the last 5 matches. And in fact, he was selected for only 1 of the last 12 matches. So Kouassi has been in and around, but recently hasn't really been part of the squad. So let's go back to a summary of the left wing position. So we did see Gradel was a starter in the Cup. He started 2 games. Wilfred Zaha, we're going to talk about a bit later, but he did start 1 game as a left winger and does sometimes pop up here. And Cornet also started 1 game. So 3 of them sharing the position there. And actually that threesome continued for a while in the position, and even still, even recently are popping up in the position, but several others came into the position, mostly players coded as forwards, and notably Kouame, who also is coded as a forward. Even more recently, though, Adingra seems to be grabbing the spot, and so we put the spotlight on both of these players, Adingra and Kouame, because we think that they'll be sharing the position. Gradel, despite being a definite to make the squad, we think is going to be a substitute by the time the tournament comes around. So let's take a look at Christian Kouame in a bit more detail. He has been with the Ivory Coast since 2019 with 25 caps and 3 goals, and he's been with Fiorentina in Italy since 2020, so no change in his club status since we last covered the team. Over the past 2 years, Kouame has started 8 of their 24 games, but subbed in for 7 and on the bench for 4. So doesn't miss that often, and has been in the position recently. But more recently is Simon Adingra, so we think he might have the edge here, even though he's new to the team since 2023. Adingra got his first appearance in March of 2023 and started 3 of their remaining 8 games. He was subbed in for 2 and on the bench for 3 others. But he's only 21 years old. But in addition to his good recent what am I trying to say? In addition to his recent starts, is his good recent form with Brighton in England, who he joined in 2022. And he was with the Union Saint-Gilloise club in Belgium that actually did better than expected in the Champions League there. So form is definitely in Simon Adinga's favour. I'm tempted to say that he'll be the starter here, but we've kind of made the prediction, I guess, that Kouame and Adingra will be kind of co-starters with not as much confidence as when I started that section. Okay, but I'm not going to change. I'm not going to go fully over to Adingra yet. Okay, let's look at the right wing, and we have moved candidate Wilfried Zaha over to the right. He's only at the possible level right now, though. And we also have, so I might as well actually cover him. Wilfried Zaha recently moved to Galatasaray in Turkey. He was with Crystal Palace for a long time before that, and Manchester United in the past, and has been part of the Ivory Coast for since 2017. He actually wanted to get onto the England team, but didn't quite make it. So joined Ivory Coast in 2017, and it's been part of the last 3 tournaments. He actually was a starter in 2017, but was as a substitute, at least started as a substitute in 2019. I'm giving too much detail because he's not in our spotlight. Anyway, he was a sub in the 2021 African Cup as well, but was quite impressive in it, I must say. Over the past 2 years, though, Zaha has only started 6 of their 24 games, but he subbed in for 6 as well. And on the bench for 7. But the reason we have him as a possible candidate is he's only been part of the squad for 2 of the last 12 games. He was injured for 4 of those. So we're not even sure he's going to actually make the cup this time. I hope he does, because he's good to watch. Okay. Amad Diallo, I mentioned his name, but he's actually probably possible but unlikely. He's injured now also. So just 4 caps for the national team. He started 1 of their games recently. I'm not going to talk about him anymore because he doesn't seem a likely candidate. He is, however, with Manchester United in England, is Diallo, but he's been loaned out to other clubs the whole time he was there. Nicolas Pepe, I'm going to mention, even though he seems to be off the team, and what a quick fall from grace, really. Pepe was with the team since 2016 and 37 caps and 10 goals. He recently moved from Arsenal, where he really didn't do that well from 2019 to 2023, and then was sold off to Trabzonspor in Turkey. And it seems like those, his progress with his club kind of mirrors his progress with the national team, as in he didn't get many starts for Arsenal and now has moved down to a lower team. And for the national team, he has not played, not been called up since November 2022. So Nicolas Pepe seemingly off the squad here, but he is only 28 years old, so there's a chance of a comeback. So let's look at the right wing position here, and players rotate a lot. We saw that on the left side, but it's even more pronounced on the right side. So we may see players coded as forwards or left wingers or attacking midfielders here. So as a case in point, it was left winger Max Allen Gradel who started in the cup, but then Nicolas Pepe played the last 3 games as the right winger, and he continued for a while, but as we saw, he abruptly disappeared in November of 2022. So really, since then, it's been the same cast of characters that were on the left side. especially Zaha here on the right side, but we do sometimes, or we did see Gradel and Cornet over here too. Recently, we've seen Bamba and Kouame over here as well, but no one playing the role consistently enough for us to see as a starter and to put in the spotlight here. So a bit tough to predict who's going to be on the right side over here. Okay, and we move on to forwards, and with attacking midfielders, we have moved a couple of attacking midfielders around if they've been playing in different positions, and we're left with just three kind of candidates at the possible level here. So we have Hamed Traore. He has moved to Bournemouth in England since 2023 and was with Sassuolo in Italy before that, and Empoli in Italy prior to that. And over the past 2 years, he returned from a 14-month absence in March 2023 to start 2 of their remaining 8 games and was subbed in for 2 and on the bench for 2. So Hamed Traore recently actually getting quite a bit of time fielded in the last 3 games. So a possible candidate, but that is fairly recent participation. Next, we have Jeremy Boga. Also possible. He has 14 caps for the national team since 2017. And both he and Traore actually were part of the team for the 2021 African Cups. Both of them were just substitutes there. And Boga started just 2 of their 24 games over the past 2 years, subbed in for 5 and on the bench for 1. So he is also a possible candidate. He recently moved to Nice in France. He was with Atalanta in Italy before that, and like Hamed Traore, with Sassuolo in Italy too. So Jeremy Boga, also with Chelsea from 2015 to 18, although I don't think he played much for them. The third possible candidate is Jean-Philippe. I don't know how to say his name. It's Gbamin, Gbamin. I'll have to learn how to pronounce that. And he returned after an absence in September of 2022 and started 3 of their remaining 6 games, subbed in for 2 and on the bench for 1. But Gbamin was not selected for the last 6 matches. And that may be because of his fall in club affiliation. He was with Everton from 2019 to 23. I don't think he played a lot for them either, because he was loaned to Trabzonspor in Turkey and CSKA Moscow in Russia, and recently has kind of fallen in club status down to Dunkirk in France. Not really a big team in France there. So he's at the possible level, but I would almost go to possible but unlikely. However, neither of these players are in our spotlight. And if you think about it, the 4-3-3 formation doesn't really have an attacking midfielder. Well, we do know that Jean-Michel Seri in the center of that 3-man midfield is coded as an attacking midfielder, so probably played a bit more forward than a central midfielder usually does. But none of these players have a grip on the position. And I think when it's a 4-2-3-1, I think it is one of the wingers like Gradel or Zaha who move over into the position. Anyway, none of these guys have a record strong enough to think that they're going to be a starter. Okay, let's move on to forwards then. We have Sebastian Haller, who will be our highlighted player, our spotlight player, even though we only have him at the likely level here. And we also have at the likely level Jean-Philippe Crasso. Jean-Philippe Crasso. So we'll do him since he's not in the spotlight. He got his first cap in September of 2022, and he only started 4 of the remaining 16 games, but he was subbed in for 5 and on the bench for 3. And so apart from the 4 African Nation Championship matches, which he wouldn't have been called up for, he's been called up every time, but usually as a supporting cast member rather than as a starter. So Crasso was born in Germany, plays for Red Star Belgrade in Serbia, having moved there from Saint Etienne in France. And we do consider him a likely candidate to make the squad, but we don't consider him a strong candidate to be in the starting lineup. Okay, next we have 2 possible candidates in Karim Konate. Karim Konate was part of the squad for the 2021 African Cup, but only started 1 of their 24 games over the past 2 years. He was subbed in for 8 and on the bench for 5, and actually has been called up recently quite regularly. So almost likely in terms of being called up to the squad, but not very likely to be a starter. Karim Konate, just 19 years old, and is with Red Bull Salzburg in Austria. Okay, the other possible candidate is Umar Diakite, and he is new to the team, actually. Got his first appearance on the bench back in June 2022, but then was off the squad until returning in September 2023. But then started 3 of their remaining 5 games and was subbed in for the other 2. So making a late bid is 20-year-old Umar Diakate, and he plays for Reims, Stade Reims in France, and he was with Red Bull Salzburg prior to that, just like Karim Konate is now. So a possible candidate, Umar Diakate, both of them actually getting some good field time recently. And finally, no, I'm not going to mention the other candidate we have on our list because he seems too unlikely. So let's go back and summarize the role of forward then. So basically, it was just 1 forward in the cup. Again, that 4-3-3, really more like a 4-3-2-1. And that role was played by Haller, Sebastian Haller, in all 4 games. And that continued for a while. It became actually a 2-man position increasingly, with Kouame joining him up there. But then we're going to see in the spotlight here that Haller went missing for a while in an interesting story. So during his absence, several players filled the role, including Nicolas Pepe, until he left the team, and Zaha, who also is not really with the team so much anymore. But Haller did return, and the position seems to be his. He's been playing there regularly since his return, although a couple of new players were tried out in November. Nevertheless, we think Sebastian Haller will be the starter in the position. So let's put him in the spotlight and take a look. So Sebastian Haller's been with the team since 2020, and he has 22 caps and 8 goals, and a big step up. Well, not a big step up, but a step up in his club career, several steps up actually. He's with Borussia Dortmund since 2022, Ajax in the Netherlands, also a good team, and West Ham before that. And yeah, kind of stepped up steadily all the way from Auxerre in France, where we've seen so many of these players start in 2012 to 2014. Haller was in fact born in France, like several of the players we've seen. The African Cup in 2021 was his first tournament, though. He started all 4 games in that cup, and over the past 2 years has started 14 of their 24 games and was on the bench for 2. However, he was out with cancer, testicular cancer, in the fall of 2022. And as bad as that sounds, it didn't actually interfere that much with his career. He really just missed 4 games because of it. And he came back in March 2023 to resume his role as a starter. So Sebastian Haller, we highlight him in green here as our spotlight player, the player we think is going to start. Okay, and that brings us to the end of our look at the candidates, and so we move into section 3, and we're gonna, in section 3, do a spotlight review. And the spotlight review will go back over the players we put in the spotlight, excuse me, I'm gonna cough. The players who we think will be starters, or starter predictions. So goalkeeper, we think Yahya Fofana is going to be the starting keeper. For central defense, we have Evan Ndika. And then we think it'll be a rotating start between Usman Diomande and Willy Bolly there. So we put those kind of together. Left back, we predict Ghislaine Konan as the starter. Right back, though, we do predict the rotation of Serge Aurier and Wilfred Singo. If it's going to be one of them, we think Serge Aurier, but we're predicting a rotation there. In the central midfield, we don't think these will be the only starters, but they're the only ones we're kind of confident will start. Will be Ibrahim Sangaré and Frank Kessie. On the left wing, we have 2 candidates in a rotation. So Christian Kouame and Simon Adingra. But we do think Adingra is kind of gaining the edge there. For the right wing, though, we don't have any candidates. We think it'll be actually an out-of-position player. Same is true for the central attacking midfielder, or they may not have that role. They may have something like the 4-3-3 where there's no central attacking midfielder. So again, we think, well, we're not really sure who they're going to use. That's what we think. But for forward, we do see Sebastian Haller as the starter. So as confident as we are about our predictions there, we're also confident that they won't turn out exactly as predicted, but there are always a few surprises. So that brings us to the preview of part 2. I don't really have any closing thoughts on Ivory Coast. So I'll move straight just to the end, the preview of part 2. And in part 2, we're going to look at basically any surprises from what we laid out here. So any of the likely or definite players who are not selected, or any players that we didn't put on the list here, or who we had as unlikely or off the squad, who do make it into the final squad. We'll kind of emphasize those. Also, any new players that come onto the scene. There's always a few of those in every tournament. And the other thing we'll focus on is injury updates as we get closer to the Cup. So we didn't see any particularly long-term injuries that rule players out at this point, but we know as we get closer to the Cup, we might see some of those. So that brings us to the end of part 1 of the mediacast here. I'm going to go back to the opening graphic, and we hope you join us for part 2, and that will be in early January, we expect. We originally planned to tag on our past, present, and future plans for the mediacast, but we have instead decided to put a link to that 10-minute video in the show notes. It covers what we're working on and what we plan to do over the next 9 months. We would like to thank Pixabay and Alexei Ivanov of Mappa Music for the wonderful background music accompanying this mediacast.